and welcome everybody who's joining us from around the world this evening. And I think it's literally around the world this evening. We've had more than 160 people sign up to join tonight's event from Angola to Zimbabwe via US, UK, Germany, Kenya, South Africa, Nepal, Nigeria, Bahrain. So we have a very wide-ranging audience. Thank you all so much for your interest in rhinos. And tonight we're going to be looking at a really exciting piece of research that was undertaken into protecting rhinos in the Greater Kruger landscape of South Africa. We will be joined by a scientist, a head ranger, and a reserve manager who were involved in undertaking, actually implementing the rhino protection interventions, but also undertaking the science and the analysis. And this work was recently published in the journal Science, where it received quite a lot of media attention. So thanks to all of you who saw that and have joined us tonight to learn a little bit more. So just to explain how we'll run the next hour, we're going to start with a brief presentation from the lead scientist that will last about 10 minutes, just because it's a very deep and detailed technical talk. So that hopefully will just explain to everybody exactly what this work was all about and what it really showed. And then with our three speakers, we'll have a panel discussion to talk amongst ourselves about some of the questions that have risen further around it. And that will hopefully answer some of the questions that you kindly submitted in advance. Then after that, we'll open up the floor to your questions as they arise. So please write your questions into the chat box here on Zoom as we go, or as they occur to you, and we'll try and address as many of those as we possibly can at the end. As ever, we must just flag that some of our speakers are joining us from remote areas, so there may occasionally be a delay or a glitch with their tech. And additionally, tonight, some of our speakers actually have live incursions and operations happening in their reserves right now. So they may have to leave us at very short notice to go and respond. So thanks to the three very impressive individuals who we are honoured to have joining us this evening. I am really looking forward to tonight's chat. They are, in no particular order, firstly, Dr. Timothy Caper. He's an African biodiversity scientist who leads solutions-driven research on human-nature relationships. He's a senior lecturer in biodiversity and statistics at the Nelson Mandela University in South Africa, and he integrates a range of methods from hardcore statistics and mathematical modeling to qualitative to stakeholder interviews and talking to people to better understand what are the drivers of biodiversity loss and support the development of African-led conservation solutions. And Tim is very much about working in a collaborative way with conservation practitioners and policymakers to address real-world challenges and contribute to actionable outcomes. And Tim will be kicking us off with the presentation of his work in just a few moments. Secondly, we're really honoured that Kathy Dreyer, who is the head ranger for Ranger Services at Kruger National Park in South Africa, has spared some of her very valuable time to be with us this evening. Kathy began her conservation career in 1999 at Addo Elephant Park with South African National Parks. She worked for SANParks Veterinary Wildlife Services Unit for many years before becoming conservation manager at Great Fish Nature Reserve in the Eastern Cape. And Kathy is one of the world's greatest black rhino lovers and champions. In Great Fish, she was responsible for overseeing the management and law enforcement of one of South Africa's most important black rhino populations, as she is in Kruger and as she has been in a number of other parks. She was responsible for black rhino surveillance and monitoring in Kruger in 2017, before in May 2021 becoming the first female head ranger in Kruger National Park. Kathy was awarded the Tusk Award for Conservation in Africa in 2016, which was presented by Sir David Attenborough, as she was recognised as an emerging leader in conservation. And finally, we are joined by Ian Novak, who is the General Manager of Baluli Game Reserve, which is one of the private reserves open to Kruger National Park. And he's also currently serving as the Associated Private Nature Reserves Warden, so leading all of the private reserves around Kruger. Ian began in the business world. He has an MBA, then he moved to the bush, moved up the ranks kind of in the governance side of chairing the game reserve until he became the head warden, and is now responsible for security of the reserve. So in charge of the polygraphing policy, the anti-poaching units, and overseeing the dehorning in the reserve. So really exciting to have someone with his field experience aligned with Kathy's field experience in both the private and state agencies to share their expertise and experiences with us. So now I will hand over to Tim, and Tim will show and tell us about the project that was undertaken to assess the effectiveness of all the different interventions that have been taken in the Greater Kruger area to try and protect rhinos. Tim, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Just checking, Joe, if you can hear me.
All good, loud and clear, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joe, for that introduction. And I'm really excited to be here this evening. And as you can see from the title, we're going to be talking about evaluating interventions that were implemented in the Greater Kruger ecosystem in South Africa, also on the border of Mozambique. And I just want to flag that this project was spearheaded by the Greater Kruger Environmental Protection Foundation. And it was thanks to the leadership, particularly of Sharon Houseman, the CEO of GKIP, who led this landmark project. And I think one of the key features of it was getting managers and scientists to work together. So it's just wonderful to be able to share the panel with Kathy and Ian this evening, and also Joe. Joe was actually one of the authors on the study, and Ian, Kathy, and Joe were all involved in this project before I was, and have been involved in the landscape for a lot longer than I have. I was kind of brought on board as the scientific lead and to lead on the statistical analysis, but this was a project conceived by people on the front line of rhino conservation who were facing a crisis and wanted to evaluate the different strategies available to reduce rhino poaching. So just for those who may not be aware of where the Greater Kruger is located, it's in the northeastern part of South Africa on the border with Mozambique. It consists of the Kruger National Park, which is 2 million hectares, 2,000 square kilometers, an enormous park. And this park is bordered by private nature reserves, the associated private nature reserves that were mentioned, those on the western border there of Kruger, so Balule, Klaseri, Umbabat, and others. And they were all participants in this project under the leadership of GKIP. So we're really excited because we were able to publish this work in the prestigious international journal Science. I always laugh a bit because I wonder how many people have actually heard of the journal Science, and we as scientists get very excited about it. But anyway, it was picked up by media around the world. And yeah, we were excited about that too. But just as I've emphasized already, this was a project led by managers. So it was conceived by people on the ground who then involved scientists. And I think that was perhaps what made it a success. So quickly, background. I'm going to move quite quickly through these slides just to give a broad overview. 11 reserves were involved, 5 years. It was actually an additional 2 years of data were used for the dehorning analysis specifically to strengthen that. Very complex system. Nearly 2,000 rhinos poached. It became over 2,000 by 2024. these reserves vary a lot in their size, their management structures, and so forth. So it's a very complex thing we were trying to do. And behind all of this is a very tense socio-political context, corruption, poverty, wildlife crime, transnational criminal syndicates. There was this hard-hitting report about just how dangerous this landscape is, not just in terms of rhino poaching, but other crimes like cash in transit, heists. And all of this will have a role on how these interventions work. So these were the interventions, everything from your typical ones, such as rangers and tracking dogs, to new technologies, to cameras with AI, polygraph testing, and then dehorning, which became the focus of this study. You'll see in a moment why. So just to show you that poaching rates varied widely across the different reserves, as did the number of rhinos present, the population. And so we were trying to understand why was poaching higher in some reserves in some years compared to others. Could that be anything to do with the interventions? It's really important to say at this point that we did more than just crunch numbers, because we believe that numbers often tell only part of the story, and your conclusions depend on the quality of the data. And what we learned really early on was the importance of manager insight. So before the study was even conducted, managers helped design what should be measured. How do we measure success? How do we measure all these interventions? Managers were then involved throughout the project and also helped when it came to interpreting the results. So we believe that this two-pronged approach is what led us to very reliable conclusions. So these are the interventions that were implemented, and it's important before you start exploring data to generate hypotheses about how these interventions are meant to work. And then you can use the statistical models to test whether there's evidence for those hypotheses, rather than just trying to find patterns in data. So basically, in a nutshell, we were trying to see whether the changes in poaching from quarter to quarter, from month to month on the various different reserves had anything to do with the interventions that were being implemented. But of course, there's a lot of complexity. COVID happened right in the middle of the study. Other things such as high-level arrests of syndicates, the changes in the socio-economic environment, all of that will have influenced poaching rates independently of the intervention. So we were very aware of this complexity. So our high-level results was that over R1 billion was spent just in those 5 years. That was a minimum estimate because for many of the interventions, or at least on some of the reserves, for example, in some of the years, the data were not easily accessible or available or retrievable. So this was just the minimum estimate. And you can see that there was vast differences in terms of how much was spent on each intervention. So I won't bore you with the statistical details, except to say that those bars with the dots in the middle represent the average effect of an intervention and then the uncertainty. So of course, when we do science, there's always a level of uncertainty, and we like to be honest about that. And so basically, if those bars overlap that dotted line, there was no strong evidence either way as to these interventions being associated with a large change in poaching. Whereas for dehorning was the one intervention where there was a strong, very strong evidence that it reduced poaching. We'll see more of that in a moment. Doesn't mean these other interventions are not working. They actually were working if you measure them by the detections of poachers, for example, arrests of poachers. Dogs and rangers and cameras achieved many poacher arrests. But in terms of being associated with reduced poaching, it wasn't this. The dehorning proved, our data suggests that dehorning was more effective overall. But just to reiterate, the cameras detected poachers. Often they detected them before poachers killed a rhino. The dogs were involved in hundreds of successful follows. The helicopters, fence alarms, all of these successfully did what they were meant to do, but they didn't necessarily translate into less significantly lower poaching in the future. Compared to dehorning, this is the data before and after dehorning on the 8 reserves that implemented it. And as you can see, on every reserve where it was implemented, there was a drastic decline in poaching after dehorning. Now, this is a graph showing that not only did poaching decline, but the trend in poaching changed from being increasing to decreasing. Now, this is the heart of our results here, and I won't go into the intricacies of the mathematical model, but it was basically showing that the change in poaching was an abrupt change. And we were therefore more confidently able to rule out other things like COVID or other interventions, because the change that happened in poaching was so abrupt, and it happened at the same time or within a few months of dehorning. So it's unlikely that some other factor would explain that difference. And secondly, dehorning was implemented from 2019 to 2021, 2022, and every time it was implemented, there was a large reduction in poaching in the months following. So our conclusions: dehorning is effective, but it's very important to emphasize that it's not a magic bullet. The more we think about it, the more we feel it's a short to medium term solution. So I know that Kruger and the private reserves are still investing in it because it's so effective, but it's not a magic bullet. And it's important to remember that we need to address the bigger drivers of wildlife crime. So demand for the horns, poverty, inequality, that makes it easier for criminal syndicates to recruit people into their operations, corruption, and these are organized criminals. So these are the bigger kind of drivers and realities that need to be addressed, and maybe dehorning is buying time for us to do that harder work. But we can't just dehorn and not do that bigger work. It's the same with law enforcement. If there was just no rangers, no dogs, no cameras, it's probable that dehorning would not have been as effective. And dehorning may divert poaching to other populations. We can talk more about that in question time, perhaps. But despite all these caveats and weaknesses, it still had drastic effectiveness in the short term, according to our study period, and it's still being supported in many areas. So I'll just rush through the last little bit. Dehorning is proactive. It acts kind of before the poacher has made a decision to poach, whereas the other ones often act, once a poacher has already entered the reserve. And there's lots of contingencies that may mean that they're less effective, not because they're bad in and of themselves, but corruption could allow people to get around them, for example. A weak court system might mean even if you successfully detect and arrest the poachers, if the sentence is not swift, fair, and certain, and there's people are let out on bail and there's repeat offending, then that kind of just pulls the blanket out from under those interventions. And also, because of this massive demand for horn and because of poverty, it's maybe a bit simplistic, but people are willing to take high risks, and there's lots of people willing to take high risks. So even if you're arresting poachers, it doesn't necessarily stop the next person from coming in. So yeah, just some final messages. I think Kathy and Ian will talk more to this. They are the people behind the interventions. And we can't forget about them. We can't be obsessed with the interventions and forget about the importance of having a motivated workforce, having strong leadership, and so forth. The same intervention in the hands of two different people or two different workforces can turn out very differently. And we haven't spoken about community engagement, transformational relationships with local communities. That's got to be part of the solution, which wasn't addressed in this study. And again, disrupting those criminal networks. But yeah, if anyone wants to scan that QR code, or if you just Google dehorning rhinos science, you will find the original article. And I believe it was open access for 3 weeks, but now it's behind a paywall, unfortunately. So if you'd like access to the full article, you can email me or email Joe or email Save the Rhino, and we'd be happy to share a copy with you. But thank you very much.
Absolutely. Very happy to share that. And please do start dropping your questions for Tim and the rest of our speakers into the chat. Great presentation. Thank you, Tim. It was a really exciting project to be part of, and so powerful to, from the outset, connect the questions from the managers on the ground. I mean, there's figures there. Just remembering again that it was more than R1 billion. It's more than 76 million US dollars that had been spent trying so hard to save rhinos in that landscape. And such a critical question to understand how best to spend that money. So a really important and powerful piece of work. And I think just another point of framing of this conversation, this was really about the use of dehorning as an emergency intervention to protect rhinos and to stop them being poached. I think people sometimes get confused about harvesting horns for trade, and thinking about this is about selling rhino horn, but that's, as you can see, that's not what the conversation is about. But there may, if there's interest, be space for a possible future webinar to really understand trade in rhino horn and the international CITES process. But this is specifically about removing the horn from the rhino to keep the rhino safe. So we will move on now to our panel and try and pick up some of the questions we've had already, and dig in a little bit more deeply to some of the points that Tim raised. Tim, the study showed, you've showed, I think, very clearly to everyone that the results indicated dehorning was the most powerful intervention, but it's important to recognize that it's not a standalone intervention, and there are many other important aspects of rhino protection. It worked on top of and as well as many, many other things that were happening. And I think it'd be interesting to hear from people on the ground what they feel are the most important things to be considering alongside these tools, the tools that can be used. Kathy, obviously you've got decades of experience in this space. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and thanks very much, Tim. And again, yeah, it was an absolute privilege to be part of such an incredible study, which I think, yeah, it's one of the few times where science and managers were kind of really brought together to make such a meaningful and impactful study. And I think when people always ask me, I generally do like animals more than people, so I steer away from saying people are the most important, but certainly in this case, I think Tim touched on it very briefly. With all these interventions, whether it be dehorning or technology, yes, they're really important, but it still really comes back to the actual people on the ground, the rangers and the people that are actually doing all the work, the faces that don't often get seen and get very rarely spoken about. And I think in recent times, there's so much negativity around rangers. We all get painted with the same brush when there are issues related to lack of integrity or corruption. But I think that it all comes still down to the rangers, the boots on the ground. And I think that we are starting to realize now that we really need to put a lot more effort and energy into wellness of rangers, mental wellness, just taking into consideration what they are up against, and in our landscape, what people have been up against for the last 15, 20 years of sustained non-stop poaching. So taking that into consideration, Tim spoke a little bit about having a workforce with integrity. Well, it really all comes down to kind of the meaning of why you're actually doing your job, and the morale, and what keeps you going and what gets you up every single day when you are faced with those numbers, which you saw, how many rhinos were poached alone in just that short study period. And just focusing on things like training, retraining, the leadership, building leadership skills, building succession, which is something that is very new to us. We all really want to romanticize what we're doing, but it is so important. It's so much more about the people. And I certainly feel that the rangers need to be heavily invested in. There was a lot of focus, and there still is a lot of focus on the actual rhino. And it's very hard to forget about the people behind the rhino and the sacrifices and what they're actually going through. As you said, people who are now, while we're fortunate enough to sit in this room and speak to you and the panel and everybody that's joined us, there's an incredible workforce out there doing an amazing job under very, very difficult and very dangerous conditions. And we really need to be more cognizant of what they're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. That's a very powerful reminder that while we sit here, there are guys and girls out there walking in the dark, in the bush, not knowing what they're going to come across, doing this incredibly important work, and professionalizing being a ranger as a profession, with a career plan, is a really important part of appreciating the vital work that they're doing. Ian, from your side as a reserve manager, and might be worth pointing out here as well that people might think reserve managers sit in a big comfy office in HQ and spend their days shuffling bits of papers around. But when Tim talks about the managers who input into the study, you're out there getting your feet and hands dirty too, right?
Absolutely. I think thanks, Joe, first of all, for having us on all together. So it was a big project for us too, and we were happy to contribute from the Associated Private Nature Reserve side. We're partners with Kruger. It's one big system, and it's a wonderful thing, the cooperation that we have, where the boundaries are just a line in the sand. Everything else is one big system. But like Kathy said there, I think the collective knowledge that we've gained over time, your workforce is very, very important. And, the manager side of things is maybe 30% of what we do. Like in any business, if you're responsible for everything, you've got to manage things like budget and so on. The rest of the time, you knee deep in it and running it, and you're on the ground. So, your title is warden and manager, because you manage the affairs of the reserve, but you're running all the conservation things, and this we've been living and eating and breathing for the last, as Kay said, some people as much as 20 years. And the days where you get to shuffle some papers are actually annoying, because it keeps you away from the things that you should be doing. So yeah, we're out there and fighting this fight, and yeah, it's just nonstop all the time. So we do get to do some really amazing things, but generally when they talk about reserve managers, we're the ones where the buck stops to make this thing a success. So we manage the ranger force, we manage everything, we manage conservation efforts, we manage the fight. It's just nonstop. So yeah, it's definitely not a cushy office. It's a lovely office when you're outside, but that's for the rest of it.
And I think one of the things that came through from the interview side of the work that Tim was doing is that it's quite an intangible thing to consider, but the experience that different managers have, and the effectiveness of a tool may be entirely dependent on the experience of the manager who's using it. So that's another factor to take into account.
For sure, and it's so important to work together, because there's no one solution that fits all. And I think that's what people need to realize. When you're sitting removed from the situation, you can say, oh, but this place is doing this and it works fantastically. Why aren't you doing it? And I think what you need to understand is that every reserve is different. Although we're open and it's one big system, is the challenges that face each reserve are not the same. The threat is the same, but the effectiveness of certain tools is not easily measured one for one, because in our reserve, we have a set of circumstances where a particular solution delivers great results, but it may not be on the scale and for whatever reason effective in Kruger. It's a very dynamic and diverse landscape. And this notion of like one size fits all is absolutely not the case. So that's the experience of your people, but it's also understanding your particular landscape and knowing the threat and where your vulnerabilities are, and then learning from one another who had similar vulnerabilities to then implement those, but always tweak it for your own landscape. And that's very, very important, because some reserves present completely different threats to, say, our reserve, and we have a solution. And it's not just to say, well, oh, it's working in Baluli or this one, so you must do it there. No, it's and that's where the information sharing is really, really important, because you can adapt the various solutions to fit your particular reserve, and hopefully across the board there's a combination. And Tim alluded to it earlier. The one thing that's consistent is dehorning has been a great result for us all. But on its own, it's not a silver bullet, and it has to be supported with multiple solutions. And again, those are also not the standard. These are the 5 things, and you need to do them. My 5 things will be different to Kathy's, and they'll be different to the next guys, but you need to support your dehorning efforts with the other solutions, and always, and that's where the experience and the knowledge and the working together comes in. You can't just pull someone with a security background and put them in the job and think they're going to be effective from day one. The learning curve is absolutely enormous, and I think people don't see that, or don't really understand the complexities behind that. There's a lot. So your people are so important, and especially your experienced people and your loyal people. And that core is, you can't bring in new people without the knowledge transfer if it's not there. And again, your landscape and exposure to other landscapes, so that you can have this combined effort, because rhino protection is a multi-layered thing for sure.
100%. Thank you both. So focusing into dehorning itself, quite a lot of the questions that people submitted in advance are interested in the impact of dehorning on the rhinos themselves. Were there any behavioral or psychological effects? Specifically, does it impact how rhinos are feeding or how they protect their calves? Kathy, here's a question about rhinos for you. What have you seen?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I just wanted to quickly add to what Ian said. I think the one thing that stands out about this study is having really incredible leadership with the courage to say we all really need to work together. Our landscape, or any landscape where there's security or intelligence, it's really hard to build trust just because so many things have happened. So I think we must never forget that the study comes out of incredibly hard work and leadership to build that trust, to get everybody to be able to share and to be very honest about what is not working and what is working, and trying to get some best practices. And I think in all of that, in trying to do best practice, we never ever want to do anything that's going to compromise the animals. We're all here working incredibly hard, so we certainly would never want to do anything that is going to negatively impact on them. And that's why it's so important for us to keep monitoring and seeing what dehorning is doing to the behavior of animals. Because again, we certainly, it's not something that we want to do. It's not something we really want to do forever as conservationists. But in having to do it, we want to make sure that we don't have unintended consequences and negative unintended consequences by dehorning. So there is a lot of work. And even though we have been dehorning extensively in a place like Kruger since 2021, it really is only 4 years. And so we still have a long way to go till we can properly understand. But certainly from what we have seen, and we really closely watch and monitor what the rhino are doing, to date, we haven't really seen any negative impacts. We dehorn rhino, we see them with calves shortly after that. We continuously have to, unfortunately, dehorn rhino, so we see the same animals. So we take comfort in the fact that they obviously have survived the experience, continue to, they calve, their interactions, their personal interactions, specifically animals like black rhino, which are very close to me. We certainly haven't seen any negative impacts, and none to the degree that we would say we need to stop dehorning. But again, I think an important thing again that the study has taught us is that you continuously have to measure and see what you are doing. And if you need to adapt and change, well, that's what you have to do. And so for now, while we are only 4 years in a place like Kruger, where we're intensively dehorning, we continue, even though we haven't seen any negative behavioral changes, we still need to constantly monitor that And again, keep speaking to everybody else in the landscape so that we're all sharing our experience of what we have seen. But it isn't a nice thing to do. I know people, when we do take people with it, is quite emotional. You know, it's loud and there's chainsaws and the rhino's immobilized. But again, we take comfort in seeing them get up. We take comfort in seeing them breeding, continue to breed, continuing to see the same animals, dehorning them again a few years later. And hopefully we get to the day when it's something that we don't as managers have to focus so much energy and time on.
Thanks, Kathy. Ian, maybe you could share your thoughts on Bululi. What have you seen?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yes, we've actually done a hell of a intensive scientific study on this, and we will be publishing a paper on that soon. It was very important to us when we started the dehorning. We committed up front to say that we know that it will work, and we were confident that it will work, but it goes hand in hand with what impact will this have on the population. So we immediately collected the data from day one and continued very, very intensive monitoring and followed up on that to make sure that there's no negative impact on the population, because you don't want to solve one problem and then create another problem, especially one that was unforeseen. And obviously there's the initial pressure that we got from outside, which was like how they're going to defend themselves against lions and things like that, which, trust me, a rhino's got no problem with the tonnage that it's got and the speed at which it can run to defend itself against the lion. The big thing was interspecies competition with those that have been dehorned versus those that hadn't. But once they were all dehorned and it was a level playing field, we noticed no significant change whatsoever. And in fact, the behavior of bulls in particular, people tend to project human characteristics and emotions onto animals, but self-awareness is a very important thing, and we don't have many mirrors lying around in the bush for them to have a good look at themselves. So after the dehorning, the territorial bulls got straight back to being territorial bulls and marking and displaying absolutely no different behavior whatsoever. So yeah, we're very comfortable, and the science now backs that up, that our gut feel was correct. And if the science had told us something different, obviously we would have done something different. But we're very happy that it's had no significant impact whatsoever.
Thank you, Ian. Of course, Vanessa did say has a paper out from KZN which did show some changes in black rhino home range sizes. And I know she's continuing a lot of research on this topic. And Tim, you're working with Lucy Chimes, who's done some work already in Namibia, and also has ongoing research. I don't know whether you have any thoughts to add on the latest science around the impacts of dehorning on rhinos?
Yes, I'll keep it brief. Yeah, I think Lucy is watching, as Lucy is my PhD student, but she's did her master's in Namibia and found she was looking at reproduction, like intercalving intervals and calf survival and other things like that in black rhinos that had been dehorned versus ones that hadn't, and found no differences. But also is now doing a phenomenal study. She's been working really hard to gather data from it's well over 50 sites across Southern Africa and comparing horned and dehorned rhinos in their particularly their reproductive health and population growth and other things. So there's a lot of good work being done, and in summary, there's no red flags raised. The only study I'm aware of is the one that Joe just mentioned, which is indicating, quite interestingly, that black rhinos contracted their home ranges in response to dehorning, perhaps because they were less confident in social interactions. But the study that Ian just mentioned, that we've conducted on Bululi on black rhinos, showed no change for the home ranges in the black rhinos on Bululi. So it also goes to show that it's very hard to make generalizations about animals when they live in such drastically different environments and such different conditions. Like vegetation availability, rainfall. And so, yeah, we're dealing with very complex things, even ecologically, before we talk about the people involved. So, yeah, I think Kathy summed it up well. No, there's definitely not enough evidence at this point to suggest we need to stop dehorning for welfare concerns. Although I would say, it's a necessary evil in a way. Like, it's not something we wish we didn't have to do it, basically, and we could leave rhinos being rhinos with their horns. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. I think all of us would much rather see rhinos with their horns, but we'd also rather see a dehorned rhino that was safe. So it's a sad necessity at the moment. Continuing the topic of horns, a lot of people were also quite interested in knowing what happens to the horns once they've been removed. So it's about taking the horn away from the rhino, changing the risk-reward benefit to criminals by reducing the value that they get. It's not about harvesting the horn itself. And of course, I appreciate we can't reveal the exact location where any of the horns are stored for security reasons. There's a certain amount of sensitivity around exactly what can be said, but there are very strict national and international protocols that control horn stockpiles. Kathy, I wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit more about that for us, please.
Yeah. So I think, Joe, it's also important to just note that the decision to dehorn was not one that was taken lightly, because there is a realization that now you do have these stockpiles, and that in itself is an incredible risk to the people that have to be responsible for them, but also a really big security risk. So again, it was certainly not a decision taken lightly, and that's why it's so important that we have the study and we all continue to monitor what we are doing. But you're 100% correct. In South Africa, we have very strict norms and standards that govern and regulate not only how we store the horns, but where we store it, specifically how they are marked in a very specific way, every sort of protected area or reserve, getting very specific reference numbers that are allocated to each single horn. They're obviously kept in very, very secure locations with very tight security. And then we also have to put additional measures in place to actually protect the people that now have to be responsible for securing these, securing the horn and securing these locations where the horns are kept. And all of this is governed quite strictly and then also audited. So we have a really, really strict auditing process to make sure that nothing is lost or nothing goes missing. And so with dehorning has come this added responsibility. There's always been a certain amount of stockpiles. Animals do die of natural causes. Animals are transported, and this may lead to them having to have their horns be removed. So there always has been a certain amount of stockpile, but obviously dehorning has just added to this. But yes, it is really very strictly regulated, as are the sites and as are the people that now have to be responsible for that. So there are really good measures that are put in place. But again, it is certainly not something that we have chosen to do, because now you just have an additional security risk, not only to the areas, but also to the place that you have to consider. And for us in a place like Kruger, it's really big, but you have to think of smaller places that now have to be responsible for this and take on this added responsibility. So again, not a decision that is taken very lightly, and a massive responsibility when you do take the decision to dehorn.
Thanks, Kathy. Unfortunately, we would have asked Ian to share a little bit about his experience from the private reserve side, and unfortunately he's had to leave us now to go and respond to a situation that's happening in the reserve. So apologies, everybody, and all the best to Ian and his team, of course. Kathy, forgive me, did you mention of course, the DNA that is taken of horns and added into the RODIS database, which is another tool that helps keep track of the individual horns from individual rhinos?
Sure. So when we do immobilize an animal to dehorn it, obviously it is also a unique opportunity where you have the animal now immobilized. And so we do try and take as much information or gather as much information while you have that opportunity. Although we do focus on trying to keep the animal anesthetized for a short amount of time as possible. You know, we really just want to go in, do what you have to do. So all the samples are stored. And if there's somebody who wants to come and do research, well, we've got a bank of samples. So it's not necessary to go out and just immobilize a rhino for the sake of getting hair or tissue or blood. It's already there. And so there's a lot of added benefits. So it's the opportunity is not wasted when you do have that 15 or 16 minutes when you are working with the animal.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I think that does show just how rigorously the safety and security of the rhinos is taken, but also the horns, and making sure that the stockpiles are properly monitored and audited, and those horns are very well looked after. So people have also been interested in, of course, you know, horns regrow. It's not as simple as dehorning and then the horn is gone and it's a one-off operation. The horns grow back. It is something that needs to be repeated. Maybe Kathy will come to you again first, just to talk a little bit about the growth rates of horns and what you see and how often you're dehorning.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, Joe, because often people talk about a dehorned rhino, but we haven't really defined what is a dehorned rhino. Because at some stage after, if you've dehorned a rhino and after 3 years you've done nothing, that horn would have grown significantly. So that essentially isn't a dehorned rhino. And I think that again, because it's only been kind of 4 or 5 years that we really have been extensively dehorning, it's so important that all this information is collected. And so one of the things that we do is when we are doing maintenance dehorning, so it's not the first time the animal is being immobilized, it's already previously been dehorned, we do measure what is the regrowth. So you can go back, because all the animals are individually identifiable, and actually see, so in a year it's grown 10 centimeters or 15 centimeters. We can actually then have reliable data, because in our landscape, there are so many animals being dehorned. I think Tim mentioned in the study, it looked at over 1,700 animals dehorned, and then regularly being maintenance dehorned. So collecting all that data is really important. And it's helped us to kind of look at how regularly we want to do it. I know most of us are now dehorning every 12 to 18 months. Unfortunately, during that period, the regrowth is enough to entice poachers to again want to go after that animal. So it is something that we're continuously having to do. But again, collecting all of that information so we can say with certainty that after a year or 18 months, we see a certain amount of growth. And again, I think it varies according to the animal's diet, where they're found, but also just within themselves. You know, bulls, really big horns, spend a lot of their time and energy trying to fight against each other. The females, a little bit more intelligent, spending all of their energy just caring for their young and not putting all their energy into growing this massive horn. And then obviously younger animals, their horns are growing a lot faster. They're in those little growing spurts and years. So there's so many variations just between the individual rhinos, their ages and their sexes, that we also still have to understand. And that's why it's so important that we keep collecting. So the opportunity when we do dehorn is never going wasted, just because there's so much that we can still learn, and so much that we still need to know to inform our decisions. But certainly within our landscape, we are seeing that at least every 12 to 18 months, you're having to go back and to do maintenance dehorning on the same animals.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The scientist in me, you know, just finds all this fascinating stuff about how different species and different animal, different demographics, of course, have different rates of horn growth. Tim, does the scientist in you have any thoughts or comments to add?
No, I think Kathy covered it all, but just to say Ian again approached me and a few others to analyze their data on horn regrowth. And yeah, as it's borne out in the data. So the rate of growth varies by sex, also by age. And we hope to publish those results soon again, to help inform discussions around how regularly to dehorn and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think if I can just add, Joe, a very big implication is actually the cost. If you do look at the cost of all those interventions, the cost of dehorning, although it might be less, it still is a really big cost. At dehorning, we just talk about it so easily now, but we are currently dehorning in Kruger. So tomorrow morning, a helicopter goes, there's a pilot, there's a veterinarian that does the darting, there's a vet tech that's responsible for taking all the samples and all the recording and gathering all the information on each single animal. And then a section ranger who's responsible with a chainsaw for actually taking off the horn and sort of guiding the team as to where the densities are, where we need to go. And so there's a team of 4 that leave in the morning and don't come back till very late in the afternoon. And all of that has a cost associated. The helicopter costs a significant amount of money. The drugs or the immobilizing drugs that we are using cost an absolute fortune. You would know, you've been really involved in a lot of those operations. So it's also just the cost of what we are trying to do. Yes, it might be less than the other interventions, but it still is a significant financial burden. And so many of us still rely on a lot of donor funding because we do see that it is paying dividends along with everything else that we're trying to do. And so, we mustn't forget the team that is waking up and having to do this. It becomes less and less romantic, I think, after you've done it for a couple of consecutive days, weeks, and months on end. But also, it is a very big financial burden on the reserves, and reserves like Baluli, which Ian manages, it's private reserve. A lot of it is on the landowners and themselves to be able to carry that financial burden.
Yeah, thank you for flagging that, Kathy. I think that's a really important point. Of course, Shushu Belozi in KZN has dehorned and required a lot, not from us, but although we do support some work there, required a lot of donor funding in order to do that. And, that investment needs to now be continued. Etosha in Namibia we work with, also, regularly dehorning as part of their security plans, and that it requires significant funding. So it's a good use of money, but it really does still need that money to be available. It's not a simple thing to do at all. Interestingly, Jamie Rupert in the chat suggested to remove a misconception, we could consider changing the name from dehorning to trimming, because we're not actually completely removing the horn, we're just trimming it. That kind of links to your point, Kathy, about it's not a one-off dehorning and the rhino remains dehorned forever. This is something that we need to continue doing. So we've got two other big questions in the chat that I don't think we've really got to, and I don't know if we're going to be able to answer satisfyingly. I don't think that's English. Satisfactorily this evening. Marlene is asking whether the study looked at possible increases in poaching in other protected areas as a result of this. This study didn't, but I think it would be a really interesting one. And somebody else, sorry, I don't see a name, asked whether there are reserves with significant rhino populations that haven't lost any yet. Yes, there are. And whether there are any thoughts on what the drivers might be for that, whether it's location or resources or a combination. We've literally got 1 minute left, so we might have to come back to that one as a whole other webinar, unless Kathy, I think Ian covered it well earlier in that each place has a really unique context and you can't just copy and paste solutions. Kathy, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's so true, Joe. I mean, it really is like what works for your area, and some of us have strengths in certain areas and others are stronger in what they are trying to do. I think the biggest things in places that haven't lost significant amount of rhino, they're consistently doing a few things right. And I think that's what we're starting to learn now by being so open and sharing information and sharing best practices, is what has consistently worked. And it's a few things that we're finding that people do and maintain all the time. I think it's a really interesting question in terms of, has our dehorning, specifically in a big landscape like Kruger, displaced poachers elsewhere? And although we're starting to see some of that, or we initially did see some of that, when other big places like HIP start to dehorn, well, then what is going to happen then? So I think that scientists now play such an important role in helping us understand things. So what is going to happen? What will happen if all the rhino in the landscape are dehorned? And so I think you're right. That's a really discussion we can have, just a whole day discussion. And how are we going to be able to, how do we continuously monitor and measure across a big landscape? And I think we all know that poachers operating in a place like Kruger operate all over the country. And so it's really important nationally for us to be able to understand what is happening and adapt. So I think, yes, although the circumstances are very different in every single place, we're also starting to see on a national picture how important it is for us to share, work together, because you're kind of really happy when it's quiet in your reserve or in your park, and you take a breath and you have a few minutes to spare. But you see how very quickly that changes. And I think we don't properly understand yet what triggers those changes. And I think the more work we do like that, the better understanding we will get about, one, what some people are doing right and what others are not doing right, but also nationally, how what happens all over South Africa impacts on us and what we can do to manipulate that possibly in some way. But I think, yeah, you're correct. That's a whole really interesting debate and a really interesting project to see what dehorning in really big landscapes have done to other rhino populations, if they have impacted negatively, and what happens when those populations again counteract and they dehorn. What happens? Where do people get displaced to? And so monitoring and evaluation, I think Tim has maybe rubbed off on our managers and ground people a little bit, because we're all talking now about monitoring and evaluation and making sure that what we're doing is working and just adapting as quickly as we can if it isn't working.
Thanks, Kathy. 100% agree with that. And I would only add, beyond thinking about how things spread and change nationally, to think about international borders and how does what South Africa does impact Zimbabwe or Namibia or even up to Kenya. Thinking, you know, at that level of joined up connectedness, recognizing that that's how the transnational criminal networks themselves work. I'm afraid, I'm sorry, Tim, I'm sorry, Kathy, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap things up there. I did briefly, before we finish, Tim mentioned at the beginning how this research was championed by GCAP, and it would be incorrect of me to finish this evening without acknowledging Sharon Houseman, the former CEO of GCAP, who very sadly passed away at the end of May, and who was an absolute champion, without whom this research would never have happened, this project would never have happened, and who did such a irreplaceable job of driving conservation in that landscape, but also pulling everybody together and fostering the kind of collaboration that made this work essential. She is and will continue to be very much missed, and I'm sure all of our speakers would join me with those join me in those thoughts and words. Thank you very much to our speakers. I think Ian has exemplified just how non-stop, high pressure, busy they constantly are, having to work to do their rhino conservation efforts. So thank you for sparing us your time, and to Tim for putting the presentation together. Thank you to everybody in the audience who's joined us to learn more and for sharing your questions. Thanks to the team here at Save the Rhino, who do all the very hard work behind the scenes to make these webinars happen. We will have more events coming up through the year. We try and do one of these every month. So there are a couple of ideas of topics tonight. Please do get in touch if you have any other suggestions of things you'd like to know more about. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we do hope to hear from you soon.